Over the course of the 1940s, Japan's once mighty fleet of aircraft carriers was whittled down. The Battle of Midway gutted the initial force, with 4 fleet carriers sent to the bottom. Subsequent battles continued to ravage the Japanese naval air arm. By the end of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was down to a mere 3 aircraft carriers, and these were of varying degrees of utility. Junyo was deemed a total loss when surveyed by the Americans at the end of the war. Hosho was largely undamaged by comparison, but was also totally obsolete. There was also Ryuho, but she was considered a total loss by the Japanese and abandoned. And then there was Katsuragi, Japan's last fleet carrier. This ship was also damaged by American air attack, but not to the point of being a total loss. It left her the final remnant of Japan's great carrier fleets, although not for long. After all, Japan wasn't allowed to keep a navy in the aftermath of the Pacific War. Katsuragi would, like most Japanese warships, not survive long after the war ended. I still feel Katsuragi is a ship worth covering, though, so let's get into it. Laid down on December 8, 1942, Katsuragi would be the final fleet carrier Japan completed. A member of the Unryu class, this ship was functionally a slightly improved take on the Hiryu design. This was done to get a large number of fleet carriers into the water relatively quickly in a counter to American buildup. While an interesting topic all on its own, that's for a video on the name ship. For Katsuragi in specific, her technical information is as follows. Katsuragi was designed with a displacement of around 17,250 tons at her standard loading. Through various changes over the course of construction, this rose to over 20,200 tons when she entered service. This displacement allowed the ship to, theoretically, carry around 50 to 60 aircraft, depending on the exact time frame you're looking at, as the planned airwing changed over time. Initially, it would have been 12 Mitsubishi A6M0s with 3 spares, alongside 27 Aichi D3A dive bombers, again with 3 spares, and 12 Nakajima B5N torpedo bombers with 2 spares this time. 57 operational aircraft with 8 spares, bringing the total to 65 aircraft. Exactly what her final loadout would have been differs between sources. The most common would be around the same total number, but replacing the D3As and B5Ns with newer aircraft. The dive bombers would be D4Ys, and the torpedo planes would have been B6Ns. There were also plans to replace the Zeros with the newer A7M, but that seems to have been even less likely to actually happen. The highest number I've seen cited is 21 Zeros, 18 D4Ys, and 21 B6Ns. There's also some reference to 11 further aircraft stored in a deck park, 9 dive bombers and 2 torpedo bombers, 71 aircraft in total. I've also seen 27 Zeros, 12 D4Ys, and 9 B6Ns cited as her final airwing, 48 in that case. The actual number on her final loadout is, as mentioned, theoretical, for reasons we'll soon see. What is less theory and more practical was the assigned weapons loadout. Katsuragi was equipped with 6 twin 12.7 cm or 5-inch dual-purpose mounts. 2 mounts were carried forward, with the final mount on the stern. 6 mounts total, with 3 on either side of the ship. These were supported by the usual swarm of Type 96 25mm guns. Exactly how many is a matter of debate. It's generally agreed that Katsuragi carried 22 triple mounts. She may have also carried anywhere from 30 to 66 of the single mount. If the latter number were true, that's 132 barrels in total. The single mounts might not have been fitted, though, and there was a mistranslation somewhere along the way in reference to the triple mounts. 66 barrels does equate to 22 triple mounts, after all. Sources differ because Japanese records are a bit of a mess to say the least. In any event, Katsuragi also carried 6 anti-aircraft rocket launchers, each with 28 rockets per mount. These would have been of possibly even less utility than the 25mm morale boosters. In simplest terms, think of them as small rocket-based versions of the infamously useless Type 3 burst shells used by the battleships. To round off the weaponry, Katsuragi carried 6 depth-charge throwers. Because Japan was having so many submarine issues that even aircraft carriers needed some sort of defense. Or so the thought went, although if you're using depth charges off an aircraft carrier, that submarine skipper got way too close. Regardless, let's finish things with the power plant. Katsuragi has the dubious distinction of being powered by destroyer equipment, generally cited as an Akizuki-class design in this case. Katsuragi carried 2 such power plants, doubled up to provide enough power to move a much larger ship than intended. This gave the carrier a top speed of 32 knots on 104,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. Perfectly respectable considering the situation. Now, with that long technical description done, I'll return to service, such as it is, as Katsuragi had a largely uneventful career. Bombing raids aside. Launched on January 19, 1944 in Kure, the ship would be completed on October 15, 1944. At which point, following sea trials, she joined the Japanese Navy. A Japanese Navy that had almost no aircraft or fuel left by this point, and would soon have almost no carriers left, as Zuikaku, the final Pearl Harbor attacker, and 3 light carriers were expended as decoys at Leyte Gulf. This was on October 25, 1944, and it left a handful of small carriers, the conversion Junyo, and 3 Unryus, as the final remnants of Japanese carrier aviation. By the end of 1944, it would be a couple light carriers alongside the fleet carriers Amagi and Katsuragi. Junyo was crippled by submarine attack in December, and Unryu was outright sunk in the same month. While Junyo was repaired enough to theoretically set sail, she would never leave Japan again. For her part, Katsuragi spent October through December of 1944 never leaving Japanese home waters. The ship evaded any attacks or damage during this time period, but she also had little to do. The ship would sail with her sister Amagi on various training exercises. These were, however, only for training the ship crew. Katsuragi never received any aircraft. Remember how I mentioned her airwing size was theoretical? This is why. By the time she was fully worked up, the Japanese simply lacked trained pilots for aircraft carrier operations. What pilots they had were either held back ashore for defensive purposes or expended as kamikaze attackers, which left Katsuragi as a perfectly functional aircraft carrier without her purpose to exist. As a reflection of this fact, after some final training in early 1945, Katsuragi was permanently docked. The ship would move between various mooring locations, but she remained in the Kure area for the remainder of the war, from February 15, 1945 to the end of the war. She had no aircraft and no meaningful chance of receiving any. Frankly, keeping the ship sailing on training cruises was a waste of limited fuel reserves. I can't blame the Japanese for deciding, just moor her out of the way, we have bigger issues. The air wing that would have been assigned to Amagi and Katsuragi, Air Group 601, would ultimately be expended in counterattacks off of Iwo Jima. They may have been involved in the sinking of USS Bismarck C, the final American aircraft carrier loss, as well as the damaging of USS Saratoga. When it came to Katsuragi, however, she would be subjected to air attacks of her own. The first of these came on March 19, 1945. Aircraft from Task Force 58 struck Kure, and Katsuragi was hit, most likely by a handful of rockets. These caused minor damage, killed 1 man, and wounded 3 others. In the following weeks, Katsuragi would move to a more permanent berthing off a small island in the harbor. Once moored there, the ship was heavily camouflaged, to the tune of having fake trees and houses mocked up by means of camouflage nets and foliage, as well as sand poured on the flight deck to create fake roads. The diagram on screen is an excellent showing of how extensive this work was. Even with all of that effort, though, Katsuragi remained fully manned. Her anti-aircraft batteries, in particular, were still armed and operational. A good thing, too, as far more extensive air raids came in July of 1945. The first raids, on July 24th, mostly focused on Amagi. Katsuragi's disguise seems to have done its job, as her damage in this attack was fairly minor. A single 500-pound bomb that wrecked an anti-aircraft gun. This killed 13 of her crew and wounded 5 more, but did little in the way of actual damage. Her luck would run out, to some extent, on July 28th. Katsuragi still took only a single bomb hit in this attack, but this bomb was a far heavier 2,000-pound weapon. It hit the ship almost exactly on the center line between the 2 elevators. This detonated inside the hangar, which caused massive damage to the flight deck. In fact, the entire deck between the elevators was bulged and buckled, with 10 meters of the flight deck outright blown off to land on top of her exhaust funnels. There was also further damage to the upper hangar deck and the hangar walls to add on to this. Specifically, 20 feet of the port hangar wall was blown out. Meanwhile, the executive officer and 12 other men were killed on the bridge when it was peppered with shrapnel. For all of this damage, however, Katsuragi survived in more or less operational shape. There was no fire of note and no underwater damage. The ship wouldn't be flying planes, even if she had any, but Katsuragi remained seaworthy. With Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, Katsuragi avoided any further damage. That said, her story doesn't end with Japan's surrender. The ship would be repaired from the worst of the damage and put back into service as a transport. The hangar was sealed, but the damage to the flight deck and elevators was left in place. Katsuragi had no need to operate aircraft. From January through April of 1946, Katsuragi carried 12,000 Japanese civilians and soldiers back to the home islands, at the conclusion of which she was pulled from service and scrapped between December 1946 and November 1947, becoming the final Japanese fleet carrier to be scrapped. Katsuragi doesn't have the most exciting story, to be sure, but she's still interesting. And in some weird alternate timeline, where the Japanese get to keep a functional navy, like, I don't know, the new Godzilla movie, this ship would likely have been the flagship. As it was, Katsuragi still has the distinction of being Japan's final fleet carrier. Not a bad thing at all. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.